If you want to understand exactly how terrified ancient men were of their partners cheating on them, you don't need to look at their poetry and you don't need to read their love letters. You just need to look at their security guards. Throughout ancient history, from the sprawling palaces of the Assyrian Empire to the inner courts of Imperial China, the most powerful men in the world utilized a very specific, very brutal method to prevent infidelity. They surrounded their wives and concubines with eunuchs, men who had been intentionally and permanently castrated. Emperors and kings would literally mandate the physical mutilation of thousands of their own servants just to guarantee that it was biologically impossible for the women in their royal households to sleep with anyone else. When you stop and really think about that level of paranoia, it forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question. Why? Why go to such extreme, violent lengths to control who a woman was sleeping with? Our modern instinct is to view cheating through the lens of romance. If someone cheats today, we see it as a devastating emotional betrayal. It breaks our hearts, it destroys our trust, and it makes us question our own self-worth. We assume ancient kings were just dealing with extreme jealousy, as if a broken heart and protecting the empire are two different things. But they aren't. In evolutionary terms, jealousy is just the biological alarm system designed to protect the vault. The devastating emotional pain of betrayal isn't a modern invention. It is the exact psychological mechanism evolution built to stop a man from wasting a lifetime of resources on another man's DNA. To understand how human relationships became so tightly and often violently controlled, we have to strip away the romance and look at the cold, hard anthropology of our species. To find the baseline of human behavior, we have to rewind the clock long before the emperors, the castles, and the gold. We have to go back to the way human beings lived for 99% of our time on this planet, as nomadic hunter-gatherers. In a traditional hunter-gatherer society, humans lived in small bands of roughly 30 to 50 people. Survival was an entirely collective effort. There was no concept of a billionaire, no concept of poverty, and most importantly, there was no concept of private property. You owned exactly what you could carry on your back. Because there were no estates, no land deeds, and no trust funds to pass down to the next generation, the concept of marriage was radically different. It was much looser. People formed pair bonds, absolutely. But those bonds weren't locked down by terrifying legal codes or the threat of execution. If a hunter-gatherer caught their partner cheating, did it hurt? Yes. But the tribe wasn't going to drag the cheating couple out and stone them to death, because a tribe of 40 people simply could not afford to execute two healthy adults. They needed every single person to hunt, forage, and protect the group from predators. In fact, the idea of exclusive, jealous ownership over a partner is so unnatural to early human survival that some indigenous cultures operated on the exact opposite logic. Deep in the Amazon basin, tribes like the Canela and the Mehanaku practiced something anthropologists call partible paternity. But this wasn't some peaceful, open-minded commune. It was a ruthless, terrifying survival tactic. In a claustrophobic jungle environment where a single father could easily be killed by a sudden jaguar ambush or a snake bite, a fatherless child was a statistical death sentence. So, a woman was actually encouraged to sleep with multiple men during her pregnancy. The biological belief was that a baby was formed by the accumulation of semen over time. One man might be the primary father, but 3 or 4 heavily scarred armed hunters were recognized as secondary fathers. They all chipped in. They all protected the child. Sharing a partner wasn't a crime. It was an extreme, calculated insurance policy against sudden death. But roughly 10,000 years ago, human beings made a decision that fundamentally rewired our psychology and our relationships. We planted seeds. The agricultural revolution allowed us to stop wandering. We settled down. We built fences. We claimed territories, and we started stockpiling resources. For the first time in the history of the world, we created surplus wealth. We had silos full of grain, pastures full of domesticated sheep, and chests full of precious metals. With the invention of private property came a new, terrifying anxiety. When a man spent his entire life building a farm, acquiring wealth, and defending his land, he needed to know exactly who was going to inherit it when he died. He needed a legitimate heir. This is the exact moment that marriage stopped being a flexible social bond and morphed into a rigid, heavily policed financial contract. In a world before DNA testing, a man faced a massive biological disadvantage. A woman always knows, with 100% certainty, that the child she gives birth to is her own. A man, however, can never be absolutely biologically certain. If a man's wife slept with someone else and got pregnant, the husband could spend the next 20 years of his life exhausting his labor, his resources, and his wealth to raise another man's genetic offspring. Paternity fraud wasn't just a betrayal of emotional trust. It was the ultimate economic sabotage. It was the theft of a man's entire legacy. Suddenly, a woman's reproductive system was no longer just a part of her body. It was treated as the vault where a man's financial future was stored. And ancient societies began building massive, terrifying legal and cultural fortresses to protect those vaults. Let's look at how this played out at the highest levels of power. In Imperial China, the emperor was the son of heaven, and his bloodline was quite literally the stabilizing force of the entire empire. The emperor's wives and concubines were locked inside the forbidden city, entirely cut off from the outside male world. The only men allowed inside the inner courts were the castrated eunuchs. But the paranoia didn't stop at the walls. The eunuchs meticulously tracked the menstrual cycles of every single woman in the emperor's harem. When the emperor decided to sleep with one of his concubines, the exact date, hour, and minute of the sexual encounter was recorded in an official ledger with a brush and ink. Why? Because if that concubine announced she was pregnant, the imperial physicians would check the ledger. If the timeline of her pregnancy did not perfectly align with the recorded timestamp of her encounter with the emperor, she was entirely doomed. There was no trial. If the math didn't add up perfectly, she was assumed to have cheated, and the punishment was absolute. The concubine would be executed, often in a highly agonizing manner, and the child would be destroyed. The empire simply could not tolerate even a fraction of a percent of doubt regarding the imperial bloodline. But if you want to prove that this extreme paranoia was entirely about protecting private estates and not about the morality of marriage, you just have to look at what happened when an ancient society didn't care about private property. You have to look at ancient Sparta. In Sparta, the state essentially owned the land, and the state raised the children through a brutal military school called the agoge. Because a Spartan man's primary focus was the military, not building a private, inheritable financial empire, their view on infidelity completely flipped. Spartans actually encouraged a form of institutionalized wife-sharing. If an older man had a young wife, he might actively invite a younger, stronger warrior to sleep with her to produce a superior soldier for the state. Because the estate belonged to the military, cheating wasn't a threat to the money. It was just a strategic way to breed better biological assets. When you look at this, the underlying economic logic of the ancient world becomes crystal clear. It was never about morality. It was never about the sanctity of marriage. It was only ever about protecting the estate. In almost every single major civilization that prioritized private wealth, from the Babylonians to the Romans, the brutal laws against infidelity only applied in one direction. A married woman sleeping with another man was a capital offense. But a married man sleeping with an unmarried woman, a servant or a prostitute, was completely legal, socially accepted, and practically expected. In ancient Rome, a husband was legally required to divorce and publicly prosecute his cheating wife. If he didn't, he could be charged with pimping. But that same Roman husband could sleep with as many enslaved women or prostitutes as he wanted, and his wife had absolutely zero legal right to complain, let alone divorce him for it. If a married woman cheated, She brought a foreign child into the husband's household. She smuggled an impostor into the fortress to steal the inheritance. She was actively damaging the core estate. But if a married man cheated and got a peasant woman or a concubine pregnant, that child was born outside the fortress. Under ancient laws, an illegitimate bastard child usually had absolutely zero legal claim to the father's wealth. The man's core estate remained perfectly safe. His legitimate heirs were not threatened. Because the man's infidelity didn't threaten the money, the law didn't care. The system was meticulously designed by wealthy men for wealthy men to ensure their empires survived their own mortality. Today, we look back at the eunuchs of the Forbidden City, the terrifying executions of the past, and the brutal double standards of Rome, and we think we have evolved. We tell ourselves that we are enlightened. We don't view marriage as a property transfer anymore. We view it as a deep emotional partnership. When a partner cheats today, the pain is incredibly real. It causes psychological trauma, it shatters our sense of reality, and it ruins families. We dress marriage up in white lace, we buy diamond rings, and we read poetry about finding our soulmates. But the next time you look closely at the institution of marriage, take a step back and look at the scaffolding holding it up. Look at the modern legal system. Look at how fiercely divorce courts divide up assets, real estate, and retirement accounts. Look at the thousands of dollars spent on lawyers battling over alimony and child support. We may have removed the threat of execution. We may have finally learned how to marry for love. But beneath the surface of the romance, the ancient machinery is still running quietly in the background. We are still signing a contract. We are still securing our legacies. Because for 10,000 years, human beings have known one undeniable truth. Love is a beautiful thing to share, but trust is an incredibly dangerous thing to afford.